We are happy to welcome Veronika Engert in our seminar series today. As part of our project, short and term spread and modulation of individual physiological stress states in the collective, we are investigating stress contagion in humans, which has been rarely studied so far. And Veronika Engert belongs to the first investigating stress contagion in humans. Therefore, we are glad and excited that she accepted our invitation to talk about her research today.
Yes, and Veronika Engert did her diploma and PhD at the University of Trier in the field of clinical and physiological psychology. And afterwards, she spent 3 years abroad as postdoc at the McGill University in Montreal, working together with Jens Brüssner. And back in Germany, she worked as postdoc and later as senior researcher and group leader at the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Science in Leipzig. And today, Veronika Engert is an independent research group leader of the Social Stress and Family Health Research Group at the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Science in Leipzig. And also, she is professor of social neuroscience at the Institute for Psychosocial Medicine and Psychotherapy at the University Clinic in Jena. And in the seminar series today, Veronika Engert will present on the physiological resonance of psychosocial stress. Yeah, and thank you very much for being here with us today. We are all looking forward to your presentation. And with that, I hand over to you.
Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming to my talk. I'm going to speak about stress regulation in the social context with a specific view on empathic stress and empathic processes and stress reduction. Now, that's a lengthy title. I was hoping for a more straightforward title and also for more straightforward results. We've been working really hard on finishing our studies in the summer, hoping to get it all wrapped up before the next lockdown, but we didn't succeed. And therefore, I can't show you exactly what I was hoping to show you. But I think I can still show you some exciting results, although they're not brand new. And therefore, there's a slight deviation from what you have read in the abstract about my talk today. So please forgive me that. Very generally, a remark about my work. I look at stress pretty much all the time in my work, and always in a context of social processes. So in my early work that I did with Jens at McGill University and the Douglas Hospital, it was all about how early life experience shapes stress regulation later in life. And then when I was at the MPI, a lot of work was done on the everyday interactions of stress regulation and our cognitions, emotion, and behavior. Presently, and also in the past years, there's been a lot of focus on resistance. I don't want to say resilience, but resistance. So kind of moving away from this perspective of vulnerability a little bit towards a more hopeful perspective of what can we do to actually buffer or protect ourselves from negative stress effects. Today, I want to focus on two of these aspects. One is the association between emotion, and here specifically empathy, and stress regulation. And the other is the perspective of intervention. So how can we use empathic processes? I don't want to say empathy. You'll see why later on. So how can we use empathic processes in buffering our stress sensitivity? I kept this very short because I think most of you are familiar with the stress axis. I have to move around your pictures a little bit. There we go. Stress begins in the brain. Upon experiencing a stressor, the hypothalamus will activate the sympathetic nervous system and inhibit the parasympathetic nervous system, which will lead to the release of adrenaline and noradrenaline from the adrenal medulla. And this part of the stress response is geared towards surviving an acute threat to your integrity. So it's pretty much what we call the fight or flight response that will determine whether or not you will successfully cope with the stressor. In parallel, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal or HPA axis will be activated through the release of corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. That will trigger the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone from the pituitary, which will eventually trigger the release of cortisol from the adrenal cortex. Cortisol has many functions throughout the body, but overall what it does is it reestablishes homeostasis after the stress response. The immediate stress response has been achieved. So after fight or flight has been done, and these processes essentially are all extremely adaptive and necessary for survival in stressful situations. However, a long-term cortisol release is a different story and can have extremely toxic effects throughout the body and the brain, which is why there's a negative feedback loop in the HPA axis. So cortisol can cross the blood-brain barrier and then inhibit its own release on all levels of the HPA axis. Also, the hippocampus needs to be mentioned. The hippocampus that is well known for its involvement in memory processes is also a central brake on the HPA axis. So it's very rich in glucocorticoid receptors, and when these are activated through cortisol, it will inhibit the further release of CRH, ACTH, and thus of cortisol to protect the body from the toxic effects of chronic stress or chronic cortisol release. I think that should be enough background to understand the measures that I'm using in my research and that I'm going to be talking about in the following. If not, you can always interrupt me and ask questions. So the everyday interactions of emotion and stress regulation I'm looking at are about empathy. Empathy research has shown quite a while ago that we share the emotions of other people by activating similar physiological patterns that are at the basis of the firsthand experience, just when observing somebody else undergoing an experience. What I was especially interested in is whether this is also true for empathy with the stress of another person. So is it actually possible that if I empathize with somebody who's in an acute stress situation, I also mount a sympathetic nervous system and an HPA axis stress response that will trigger the release of cortisol, although I directly experience no stress at all. The sun is coming towards me, sorry. Although I directly don't experience any stress at all. We had different ways of looking at this. Let me first give you a definition of empathy. There's many definitions out there. Most of them are fairly broad and subsume different empathic processes, such as emotional contagion, for example. The one that I'm going to base myself on for the current talk is a bit more narrow. The reason for this is that simply this was the definition that we were working with when we did our first empathic stress study in the lab of Tanja Singer in Leipzig. So empathy, according to this definition, is the process of understanding the affective state of another by generating an isomorphic state in the self. Isomorphic means same in shape, same in form. The empathic individual, having this response, is aware that the source of the affective state doesn't lie within him or herself, but lies in the other. One of the first researchers who looked at shared physiological substrates for empathy was Di Maschio, already in the 50s. What he tested was heart rate in psychotherapist diets, so in patient and psychotherapist. And he found that increases in heart rate in the patient were accompanied by proportional increases in heart rate in the therapist. After that, it took a long time till the 2000s, till 2000 exactly, until somebody looked at empathy or correlates, physiological correlates of empathy in the brain. And it was Tanja Singer who in 2000 found that empathy for the pain of somebody else and the firsthand experience of pain activated similar regions in the brain, mostly the anterior insula and the anterior cingulate cortex. So this is the work that really triggered my interest in empathic stress. And it was also very nice that I started a postdoc in the lab of Tanja Singer in Leipzig when she had first started her group there. And it was one of the first things that we did together was look at empathic stress. Before diving into the results and the methods, it's important to look at some theoretical considerations. If you think about empathic stress, you can see that there must be different forms of it. So we defined stress contagion and stress resonance. I think these terms are changing, and many people have since been using them slightly differently. That's why I want to give you a short definition of my major working definitions in this context. So for one thing, there's stress contagion, which would mean that when you observe somebody else undergo a stressor, a stressful situation, you mount a stress response irrespective of what the person who's actually directly in the stress situation feels. So somebody who observes a stressful situation shows cortisol release irrespective of what the person who's in the situation shows. And this is probably highly linked to the general stress sensitivity of an individual. In stress resonance, and that's of course the form that I find much more interesting, there would be proportionality between what the observer feels and what their physiological stress system does and what the person in this direct stress situation feels. So here we would have resonance, for example, in cortisol levels between the target, which is the directly stressed individual, and the observer. How did we study empathic stress? Well, we invited diets to the lab, and we always stressed one partner of each diet. In the Trier social stress test that many of you will be familiar with, it is a standardized laboratory stress test that works very well in inducing a physiological and a subjective stress response. Participants are exposed to a mock job interview. So they're being filmed, they're being observed, they're being evaluated, at least they think they're being evaluated. And they have to talk about their own strengths and weaknesses and do difficult mental arithmetic. So these two components generally more or less stress almost everybody who undergoes this test. So one person did this test and the other person of a diet watched. And this other person was either a real life partner of the person that was being stressed, or it was a complete stranger, which is what is signified right here in these little people that either hold their hands or stand apart. And then the observing took place either more or less directly or real life by sitting behind a one-way mirror and having a nice overview of the entire situation of this Trier social stress test, or it happened virtually, so that people were in another room and had a live transmission of the TSST, but they were focusing on the face of the target. So they could not see the entire situation, but they could very in high resolution see the face of the person being stressed. And eventually it was always a man that was watching a woman being stressed, or vice versa, a woman watching a man being stressed. This is the first batch of results that we found. So here you see the percentage of cortisol responders in our observers. This means that these are the people that by solely observing somebody else undergo a stressful situation mounted a physiological stress response of which we say that it has physiological follow-up effects in the body. So it's not just a statistical increase in cortisol levels, but it is an increase in cortisol levels of which we know that something happens afterwards in the body. And we had over 200 observers, and out of those, 26% showed physiological meaningful response just by observing others undergo stress. And for those of you who were implicated in stress research, they will know that that's actually quite amazing, because it's not that straightforward to trigger cortisol release, even in a direct stress task. So for example, if you play with the variables in the TSST, if you put in only one observer and that observer doesn't wear a white lab coat or there's no camera, already you'll see that there's immense reductions in cortisol stress release. So finding this simply by means of watching somebody else, I thought was quite amazing. What you see in the second little graph is that there was much higher release of cortisol in the observers if they were watching their own partners than if they were watching strangers, about 40 versus 10%, if I recall correctly. And also if observers were watching through the one-way mirror. So if they had a more broad overview of the stressful situation as opposed to a close-up to the face of the stress target. Men and women didn't differ in their cortisol, observing cortisol stress release. I think that's quite interesting. If you ask men and women how empathic they feel, it's always women that say that they feel that they have much more empathy than men. But if you look into the biological correlates of empathy, so for example, in Tanya Zinger's empathy for pain paradigms, where she looks at empathic correlates in the brain, or in these data, it looks like the biology doesn't really confirm those self-reports. So it looks like men and women have more or less the same levels of empathic activity. Now, this is just looking at, is there cortisol release in the observers or not? What's much more exciting, of course, is whether there's resonance with the targets that undergo the direct stress. And indeed, there is, especially in the partners, which you see on the left side here, as opposed to the strangers, and in the one-way mirror condition, as opposed to the video condition, you can see that on average, there's resonance, so proportionality in the cortisol released in the observers and the cortisol released in the targets. There's also resonance in some people among the strangers and among the video condition, but not on average. So it doesn't mean that there's no resonance happening at all. Now, I think these results obviously trigger the question, so why why would somebody have an empathic stress response? Is this adaptive? Is it maladaptive? Should we, am I saying that empathy is bad because it stresses people out? And I don't think I'm necessarily wanting to say that. I think for me, what this data shows is that clearly the occasional empathic stress response must have an adaptive meaning for an observer, possibly in warning them of danger that is imminent, or also in explaining in a way or helping understand social situations, helping understand other people, and alternatively in simply generating energy to help other people. So I think there's many possible advantages that one could see in having an empathic stress response. But given that we're looking at cortisol releases of which we say that they're physiologically significant and that they mean something and that they have follow-up effects in the body on the immune system or on the metabolism, etc., you could see that some people may be actually in a position where chronic empathic stress could become dangerous for their health. Imagine people of chronically stressed, children of chronically stressed parents, or partners of chronically stressed spouses, or people working in helping professions like nurses or psychologists or doctors, or name them, social workers. I mean, there's many people that on a daily basis, especially in a situation like right now, experience the stress of others because they can't get away of these others. And it could be hypothesized that there and in these subgroups, empathic stress could actually have an important negative effect on health. And because everything that we looked at in this study was done in the confined laboratory context in somewhat unnatural conditions, before moving on and looking at potential health effects of empathic stress, we wanted to see whether there's any ecological validity to what we found in real life. So we took our partners, these guys here, from this very study and followed them over several days in their normal life. So both partners would take cortisol levels over the course of the day. I think it was 8 cortisol samples over the course of 2 days. And they did that irrespective of whether they were together or not. So they started early in the morning after waking up. So their first 2 or 3 measurements were probably while still being together, having breakfast together. And then each of them went their ways, because this was pre-corona and we were not confined to our homes. And then we looked whether empathy, so emotional empathy, and the empathic resonance that some of these people felt when observing their partners in the laboratory had any influence on how much they covariated in everyday life. And what we found was that, yes, it's actually those people that have the highest subjective empathy and that correlate with their partners in the lab situation that also co-vary in cortisol with their partners in everyday life. So here on the x-axis, you have the participants with the lowest, middle, and highest percentiles of cortisol resonance in the laboratory. And you can see that those with the highest cortisol covariance in the laboratory are also the ones that show the highest diurnal cortisol covariation, as opposed to those with the lowest cortisol resonance in the lab and diurnal cortisol covariation. So what this shows us is that covariation in the lab does have some ecological validity in real life, and that our daily endocrine functioning reflects not just our direct experiences, but also the endocrine functioning of those people that are close to us, particularly so for people that have high empathy subjectively and that are prone to synchronize with their partners in acute stressful situations. Now, what I thought was especially exciting about these results is that we found these this high cortisol covariance absolutely irrespective of whether or not people were together in their everyday life. So it wasn't just those samples that were taken while participants were together in the morning or the evening, but all of them taken over the course of the day that drove this effect of cortisol covariance. Now, as I had mentioned earlier already, linked diets may actually influence each other on a daily basis towards healthy regulation of the stress system, but also, of course, towards harmful diurnal cortisol profiles. And an increased risk for stress system dysfunction and stress-related disorders may be seen in people that are chronically closed to very stressed individuals. Here, I actually wanted to show you newer results, show you results about cortisol covariance between mother and children and how this influences cognitive performance in the children. We have some preliminary data, but it was just too preliminary to put in this presentation. I can tell you already that there is also covariance between mother and children. And we don't know about cortisol yet, but definitely we find it in sympathetic nervous system activation. So children also covary with their mothers when they watch them in how they increase their heart rate. And this seems to have effects immediately afterwards on how well children can concentrate and be attentive to tasks that we give them. And I really hope that one day soon, when the lockdown is over, we can really keep on working on this data. So what I'm focusing on more now is how can we, like, knowing how much social factors are involved in creating a stress response, how can we possibly use social factors to buffer our stress sensitivity, to use this association in a positive way? And this is where my intervention research comes in. And what I'm showing you now is mostly with respect to direct stress sensitivity, but I hope to be able to make the connection later on, how this must and probably has an influence on empathic stress sensitivity even more. And this is also something that we are currently investigating, but the studies haven't been happening over several months now due to the lockdown, unfortunately. Before I go into the intervention details of what we have done to see whether social factors can be used to reduce stress, let me say a few words about different routes to social understanding. We've been talking about empathy a lot, or I have been talking about empathy a lot, which I defined already as suffering with somebody else who's having a negative experience, but being aware that the source of that negative experience isn't within myself, but is within the other person. Emotional contagion, we think, is something that is there prior to empathy, is already there in very little babies, but also happens, of course, in adults. And it means that you catch somebody else's emotion without being aware of this at all. So it would really be a physiological contagion process. In babies, we see this very explicitly. If one baby cries, the other baby starts crying as well, simply by hearing the crying. But we know that it also happens if you watch, for example, somebody else cry or making a very sad expression, that not just the feeling is contagious, but also the physiological basis of that feeling. What's more important here is the differentiation between empathy and compassion. Because compassion, which is Mitgefühl in German, as opposed to empathy, and in German we often use this in a similar way, but I think it's very important. I'm going to go somewhere else now. It's very important to make this differentiation, because compassion is more than empathy. In a way, you need empathy to be able to be compassionate, but if you're compassionate, you generate a positive emotion on top of the negative emotion. So compassion goes beyond this excessive sharing of negative affect. And it has been shown in studies that it is in fact linked to positive emotion and to reward activation as opposed to pain activation in the brain. And what it does simply is to wish well to somebody that you see is in pain or in distress. So instead of remaining in this, oh my God, this person is in such a bad situation, I feel so bad with and for that other person, I go a step further and say, I wish well to that other person. And although that might seem like a very marginal step, it has a huge implication on what you feel after generating compassion. And just for completeness sakes, both empathy and compassion also have to be differentiated from theory of mind, in which you cognitively understand what somebody else feels or even thinks, but there's no emotional involvement. And in the end, of course, The aim of all of this emotion ideally would be pro-social behavior towards other people in distress. And what's very interesting is that while compassion is highly correlated with pro-social behavior, empathy is not. Because apparently, if people feel too much empathy, sooner or later they will just shut down because it's too painful to rest within this negative emotion. And I'm showing you all of this to better understand what we did in the intervention that I'm going to be talking about. This intervention was a mental training or meditation intervention. The resource project, some of you may have heard about it. It was initiated by Tanja Singer at the Max Planck Institute here in Leipzig. It was a very long and tedious study that ran almost over 10 years. The theory behind this research was kind of sparked in the early 80s by the work of John Kabat-Zinn, who created the mindfulness-based stress reduction program, which is Achtsamkeitstraining in German, and an immense interest of research in the years after that in studying the effects of such mindfulness-based stress reduction on both subjective well-being and the body. And there's an incredible amount of interesting studies out there. But when we started this study and we started planning our outcome measures, it was quite curious that despite the name mindfulness-based stress reduction, there wasn't actually any convincing research out there showing that MBSR, in fact, reduces the acute stress response, at least the acute cortisol stress response. There's a lot of research out there on how people feel subjectively less stressed. But I mean, there's always that little questionnaire in subjective self-reports and assessments, whether there's not a lot of wishful thinking involved in those results, right? So it was one of the very central aims here for me in the context of the resource project to see in how far mental training actually reduced the acute cortisol stress response. There's another focus of the resource project. Mindfulness-based stress reduction is, in a way, a potpourri of very many different training techniques. The most central one, I would say, is to train attention and interoceptive awareness. Every mindfulness or Achtsamkeitskurs does that. But many, and to a lesser degree, but many mindfulness-based stress reduction courses also train emotional affect generation, so compassion in a way, to generate positive affect towards yourself and towards other people. And then there's also, yet to a lesser degree, but there's also a cognitive component to mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is to learn to distance yourself from your own thoughts and to kind of learn to take a metacognitive perspective and see that my thoughts are not necessarily the truth and that they will pass and that maybe in a week I will have other thoughts about a certain experience. And what we wanted to do in the resource project is take these extremely different techniques and separate them from each other and look at what is the contribution of each of these to subjective well-being and health. So all of this, I hope, will help you understand this slide in which I show you quickly what people trained in the resource project. So there were 3 modules. One was called presence, one was called affect, and one was called perspective. What was trained in presence is the main ingredient of MBSR, so attention and interoceptive awareness. People did classical meditation practices, breathing meditation, and body scan. I can tell you more about that later if you're interested. In the affect module, people trained empathy and compassion, pro-social motivation, and dealing with difficult emotions. And they did this in 2 exercises, the so-called loving kindness or metta meditation, and an affect diet, which was nothing else but, in a way, a pair meditation exercise with another participant. And in the perspective module, they trained metacognition perspective taking on self and on others, again, through 2 exercises. One was a perspective exercise, dyadic exercise, and one was the so-called observing thoughts meditation. And most of the participants trained these 3 different modules in sequence, in different sequences. They generally started with the presence module to learn to stabilize the mind, and then to control for sequence effects, differed in whether affect or perspective was trained first. All of these are 3-month training modules. Because we were especially interested in the effect of affect meditation, so compassion and empathy, we also did a cohort that only trained affect without confounding it with presence training prior to it. And then, of course, there was a retest control cohort who took part in all our testing assessments at T0, baseline, T1 after 3 months, T2 after another 3 months, and at T3 after altogether 9 months of training, but had no intervention. So this is what you need to know about the methods of this study. And now let's look at some results on health. First, on reactivity to acute psychosocial stress. Here we did the TSST as explained earlier. So participants were exposed to this laboratory task. What's important to understand is that because this is a longitudinal project and we didn't want to traumatize our participants and maybe have like an increased dropout rate after the TSST, we only did this test once. So although this is overall was a within subjects design, this specific acute stress testing happened in a between subjects design. So that every participant, or that there were groups of participants being stressed in different times during their training sequence. What did we find? Now here we're looking at cortisol stress responses. Is the typical stress response as we would expect it by the no training group. If you remember, is in blue. They show a clear summit peak in cortisol release about 20 minutes after onset of the stressor, and then they drop back to baseline levels about an hour after stress termination. The people who trained presence, so the heart of mindfulness-based stress reduction, attention and interoceptive awareness, showed the absolute identical stress response. So no reduction in cortisol stress reactivity after the training of attention and interoceptive awareness. Participants who only trained affect for 3 months were significantly reduced in their cortisol stress response, and participants who trained 3 months of presence and then 3 months of affect or perspective showed clearly reduced, over 50% reduced cortisol stress responses. If we look at subjective stress reactivity, all modules equally reduced the anxiety and the subjectively felt stress in response to the TSST. So I find that very intriguing, and I think it's actually very easy or straightforward to see what happened here. For one thing, we replicate what many other people have showed us: subjective stress, mental training, mindfulness-based stress reduction reduces subjective stress. The fact that specifically the heart of mindfulness-based stress reduction, that is the training for attention and interoceptive awareness, doesn't reduce stress reactivity, is probably because these participants only trained to listen to what goes on in their bodies and to be attentive to that. And that probably isn't what can be responsible for a stress reduction in an acute situation. To the contrary, I would think it might even make you more aware of how stressed you are, and even somehow give that stimulus more of an impact on you. And compared to that, those people who train social abilities, either socio-affective or social cognitive in nature, they showed decreased stress vulnerability. And I think the reason for that is that by constantly wishing other people well and being understanding, both with yourself and both with other people, will help you to feel more strength in a situation in which you're personally attacked in a psychosocial stress situation by other people. No matter whether the capacities you trained were socio-emotional or socio-cognitive in nature. We have a whole lot of other biomarkers that we also looked at, and this is just for the sake of completeness. I want to show you that none of them were sensitive to the training intervention. Neither alpha amylase, which is a marker of sympathetic nervous system activation, nor heart rate, nor parasympathetic activation, which we measured in terms of heart rate variability, nor pro-inflammatory activity, which we measured in terms of interleukin-6 activity and C-reactive protein, two pro-inflammatory markers. Now let's look at effects of mental training on more baseline assessments of health and stress. One of them is the cortisol awakening response, which is a peak in cortisol release that happens shortly after awakening, of which we know that it's a distinct facet of the circadian cortisol rhythm that everybody has. We think that the cortisol awakening response gives us the necessary energy to cope with the anticipated demands of the upcoming day. And we also understand it as an indicator of anticipated stress and potentially also a risk factor. Because if you imagine that somebody constantly anticipates high stress in the upcoming day and hence chronically has an increased CAR, that could lead to an accumulation of cortisol in the body. And higher cortisol awakening responses are also associated with hippocampal atrophy in older adults and different psychiatric conditions like depression, for example. What we found was that specifically the training of empathy and compassion, so affect training, reduced the cortisol awakening response. No training had no effect. Presence training actually increased it, and so did perspective training. But affect training, so our positive emotion generation, had a decreasing effect on the cortisol awakening response. And because we know that increased levels of cortisol can have an impact on the hippocampus, we were interested in seeing whether there's any link of this decrease in CAR with changes in hippocampal structure. And what we found was that just like for the cortisol awakening response, degree centrality of the hippocampus, which is how well the hippocampus in a way is embedded in its network of neighboring regions, how well the crosstalk with its neighboring regions works, also has somewhat similar patterns of results in that perspective training reduced the hippocampal degree centrality and affect training slightly increased it. But what was more important is that when we put together the cortisol awakening response and the degree centrality, we could show that the increased hippocampal degree centrality was associated with the decreased cortisol awakening responses after the affect training. So if after affect training, people had less anticipatory stress when waking up in the morning and in a way getting ready for their day, they also had a better crosstalk of their hippocampus with its neighboring regions. Another chronic stress marker that we looked at is hair cortisol. That's really nice that this marker exists because it in a way gives us a systemic measure of cortisol exposure, much better than when we measure cortisol in saliva, as we did in the acute stress test. We know that cortisol accumulates in the hair shaft when the hair grows, and it's a reliable measure of systemic cortisol exposure in 3 centimeter segments. So if we measure cortisol in the hair in 3 centimeter segments, we know how much stress a person felt in the 3 months prior to cutting his or her hair off. And the advantage in a study like the resource project is, of course, that we could have a stable, or that we could assess training effects on a long-term basis. What we found here And now this is a bit different than earlier for the cortisol acute stress data, because we assessed hair cortisol over the course of the entire training in a within subjects design, is that in the no training group here in blue, hair cortisol levels didn't change. But no matter what participants trained, whether it was presence, affect, or perspective, after 6 months of training, or even already after 3 months, hair cortisol levels were clearly reduced. Later at 9 months, there's a little regression to the mean, but reductions in hair cortisol levels are still always significantly different than at the individual cohort baselines and significantly different than in the retest control cohort. So no matter what people train, their systemic cortisol levels and hence their chronic stress seems to decrease. And it's important to train longer than 8 weeks. 8 weeks of training, which is the typical format of mindfulness-based stress reduction programs, is not enough. You need to go beyond that and train 3 months or more. 6 months is even better to show a clear effect on your hair cortisol levels. Interoception is another really exciting measure to look at. It's the ability to sense physiological processes in our body. And we know that it involves very different processes, such as accuracy and perception of bodily signals from skin, muscles, and viscera, but also accuracy and perception of our own thoughts and of our own emotions. What's most studied is heartbeat perception accuracy. That's also a measure that we looked at. And what is done here is that we ask participants to count their own heartbeats as good as they ever can. And in parallel, of course, we assess their own heartbeat using ECG. And then we can build a ratio of accuracy by comparing the subjective and the objective amount of heartbeats that happened within a certain period of time. We know that heartbeat perception accuracy, this measure of interoception, is linked to awareness of our own emotions, awareness of others' emotions, and that it's implicated in psychological and physical health. In parallel to assessing heartbeat perception accuracy, we also had participants repeatedly respond to the Toronto alexithymia scale, which gives us a measure of emotional awareness. And what we could see is that just like for the hair cortisol data, the heartbeat perception accuracy, so the interoceptive awareness, increased over the course of the training and reached meaningful increases only after 6 months of training and then kept on rising. And in parallel, alexithymia scores were reduced and also associated with this increase in heartbeat perception accuracy, which means that emotional awareness likewise increased. So if alexithymia levels go down, emotional awareness goes up. Another important marker, this time of health and less of stress, that we wanted to see change in with respect to the resource training was in pro-inflammatory activity. Here we studied interleukin-6 and C-reactive protein. Both are markers of pro-inflammatory activity and associated with clinical immune conditions such as cancer, depression, or cardiovascular disease. Relatively increased levels of IL-6 and C-reactive protein without any incident of disease signal low-grade chronic inflammation, and reversely, decreased IL-6 and CRP levels are associated with improved physical and emotional health. We looked at these levels again at every or after every module that participants trained, and we found no overall change in these inflammatory markers. Only when partialing our participants into bins with respect to their baseline inflammatory load, we could see that those people that were actually vulnerable, those that had high baseline inflammatory load, so high baseline levels of CRP and IL-6, were the ones who selectively profited from training attention and interoceptive awareness, shown in yellow here. And this was true both for IL-6 and for C-reactive protein. Here you can see that even in the participants with medium baseline levels of inflammation, there already was a clear advantage of training, but even stronger so in those that had high baseline levels of CRP. Now I want to come back to compassion. After showing you these many effects of mental training on markers of health and stress, I kind of want to bring it back to the empathic stress and make the statement that I think training compassion is probably one of the most efficient ways that we can address empathic stress. For one thing, of course, we see immense effects in addressing direct stress. So both on cortisol and subjective acute responses, on the cortisol awakening response and associated hippocampal degree centrality, on systemic cortisol levels, on interoceptive capacity and associated emotional awareness, and on inflammation. On all of these, oops, sorry, that is actually not true. There is no effect on inflammation. This, I have to absolutely revoke that statement because this is a specific effect of mindfulness training. Nevertheless, I think that the key to dealing with empathic stress must be to somehow remain tuned in to the people that we're surrounded by. We can't just stop being empathic. I don't think that can be the solution to no longer feel stressed ourselves by what other people are experiencing. But I think the key would be to learn to create a compassionate stance towards other people and to get out of this excessive sharing of others' negative emotion into a state where we're capable of wishing other people well, but nevertheless not being subjectively pulled into their pain. And currently we are looking at this. We have a big study in which we compare different intervention strategies in how well they can buffer the empathic stress response. And what we're looking at specifically is, of course, what does compassion training do? Not a long training like the resource project, but only a week training. And on the other hand, what can biofeedback do? So if we learn to decouple specifically our parasympathetic nervous system activation from the people around us, can we regain control over our own stress response? And then this, of course, we're also comparing to the group who doesn't train anything and a group who trains something of which we expect has no effect on empathic stress reduction. And I wish I could show you more about these results, but unfortunately I cannot at the present moment. So I still hope you have some interesting comments and questions, and I thank you for your attention.
Actually, I have two questions, and they go back to the stuff you were talking about more towards the beginning about when you have pairs that have coupled stress with each other. And I was wondering, you mentioned that they had coupled stress even when they were not together. And I was wondering what you thought could be the mechanism behind that. Like, is it that they're communicating with each other via text message, or like, is it that they have some kind of diurnal patterns that got coupled somehow, or what's your thought?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, and we thought a lot about it, and of course we can't really give you great answers. I think communicating with each other via phone over the entire day, which is what so many people do all day, right, is probably a really important factor. And I also think that there might be some kind of anchoring in the morning when people get up together, have their breakfast morning chat, and are like, oh yeah, of course you have the presentation you have to give, and I have to talk to my boss. And I think that really puts them in tune with each other and kind of starts them on a similar, on a covariant line. and then they keep that up during the day. That's my best guesses, really. This is somewhat related, but actually it's not. We of course we looked. I didn't mention that, but of course we also looked whether things like the relationship quality played a role, and also the length of the relationship played a role. The relationship quality, curiously, didn't play a role at all, but they were all pretty satisfied with the relationship. So maybe those that were like at the verge of breaking up just don't show up to a study together. So that probably is a reason for this. What was also interesting is that there was an effect of relationship length. And we thought that the people who were together the longest would resonate the most, but they didn't. It was the opposite. People who resonated most were those who weren't together as long yet. So the whole resonance might also be very strongly linked to what they're going through in their relationship at that moment. So I could also see that as an explanation, that if you're more in the beginning stages of a relationship, maybe you actually fight more about, like, because you're still kind of getting into the swing of it and have to figure out how the other person works. So I could see that there's maybe more salient, I don't know how to say it, more salient moments throughout the day where you get into topics that are important for both of them and that equally activate both of their systems.
I wanted to follow up on your last answer to Ari's question there, because I had a similar question, and I don't know whether or not your timeline data with the salivary cord allows you to address this or not, but it's possible in my mind that the covariance among partners, this kind of hormonal compatibility resonance result that you found, could in theory be explained by a third factor. They're in a shared environment. You could easily imagine how, for example, having a special needs child creates stress that is irrespective and independent of any kind of resonance effect between the two interacting partners. So I was just curious to see if you have any thoughts about that and if your data allow you to tease that apart.
Unfortunately not. I think it's absolutely true. I mean, totally, you could think that. You could also say that, you could also imagine that somehow people, like gleich und gleich gesellt sich gern, that people who have a certain rhythm are attracted to other people with an equal rhythm, right? This is also kind of along the same lines of the shared environment. I absolutely agree, and I think there's a lot of the covariance. I mean, the covariance is immense. It's extremely high. I didn't think that there would be such high covariance overall. There's some people who have very low covariance, but most of them are quite close. And what shows me that there's still truth to the idea that some of it is linked to empathy is that the covariance is higher if people have higher emotional empathy. So those people that say, I feel more with my partner also have higher covariance. And that the same is true for how much they resonated in the lab. So the whole lab situation, I think, really is special and not due to shared environment, but it's really how sensitive do you react to what the other person is going through. And the fact that this was clearly linked to how much they covaried over the course of the day, I think it still has clearly a contribution to the covariance, but there must be many other factors that contribute to it that we unfortunately don't know. So we don't even know whether, we don't even know who has children, and all of this data was unfortunately not assessed.
This also goes back to the mechanism behind the resonance that you observed. And the question I'm asking myself all the time is who's following whom? So if you have this kind of convergence in their physiological markers, is somebody adjusting to the other person? And if so, what are the mechanisms that determine whether you are approaching your partner or your partner is approaching you? And the reason behind that is this very early Clemens-Kirschbaum study, which of course you probably know and are well familiar with, who showed that if you bring the partner in, then depending on the sex, it's either the stress response going down in the one who is stressed, in the case of men, or it's the not stressed partner going up in their stress response in the case of women, the 95 study, which would suggest that it can go either way. But the question, of course, is what are the factors that determine that?
Yeah, I think that's super interesting, and we have something that we want to look at, but this only works for people being acutely together. So what on earth happens when they're not acutely together, and who follows whom? I can't even give you a good idea, honestly. I mean, you could say that the more sensitive follows the less sensitive, right? But sensitive to what and why and anyway, but what we so we have this super exciting cooperation with a company that makes these online biofeedback what do you call it, online feedback machines or devices that feed you back your parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. And what we want to do with this is to kind of get to that a little bit, at least in the context of where people are all together, is of whether there's something like an ideal parasympathetic sympathetic ratio of healthy regulation that has a strong that resonates strongly with other people. So whether you have something like leaders in a group that, based on their either very good or very bad ratio of parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous activity, are more prone to have an influence on other people. I really believe in that. But I have, for now, I can't give you anything more than that as an answer to your question. I would think that there's also the potential of smells being important mechanisms of why you would follow somebody or not, but this is all completely hypothetical. And what we're looking at right now as well is whether a strong mimicry also has a strong effect. So if somebody doesn't really have much expressivity in their face, you would think that maybe people wouldn't resonate that much to this person, as opposed to somebody who really shows their feelings clearly on their face, would be more likely to trigger others following.
I have a question going in a similar direction. So I was curious if different channels of communication between the people have an effect. For example, do I have to see, I mean, if I see the other person's face or the body, does it increase this resonance, or is it enough when I know the other person is stressed? So I saw you had two conditions where you have this mirror and the computer. So I'm interested in this computer mediated communication, and how this would affect, if you have any hypothesis about this affects stress. And the second question I had is a little bit more general. So I know that this concept of mindfulness has been developed probably in the East, I guess. And now it's very popular also in the West. I mean, the big tech companies, Google, and they all use this training now. And I wonder what do you think is the effect of using it in a completely different context? And is it more used for self-optimization purposes to become more resilient against stress? Or do you think the goal is also, a little bit more, I don't know, developed in a different way originally? Or what do you think about this discrepancy?
Okay, question one. Super question, and I always have this in the back of my mind, and then I forgot it in the talk. So we did these two conditions. In one, you had more of a general overview of the situation. In the virtual one, you really saw a close-up of the face of the person who was being stressed. And we thought that being able to see very subtle changes in things like redness of the face, pupil dilation, mimicry, that this could be actually the driving force of the resonance happening. So we weren't so horribly sure that we would see effects. So this was, in a way, a way to potentiate the stress that somebody was feeling by zooming up on it through the virtual condition. And clearly it went with less resonance, right? So the hypothesis behind it was just like you said, that you potentially through this channel can even transmit more information, but it seems like it's more important that you see the context, and that you really, that you understand the situation in itself rather than just autonomic fluctuations, right? So I might have lost track with respect to your questions. What I'm thinking about, how via the virtual channel the stress can be transported, is that what you asked?
Yeah, so for example, is it enough if I know in another room there's a person who is stressed, but I don't see the person at all, but I know they go through a stressful situation right now? Would it trigger like the same responses as if I would see the person like in front of me, like in a specific posture and suffering maybe? Or
I think it's that. I think it's the posture, it's seeing the nasty committee, it's all of these components that really trigger the resonance and that really trigger the release of cortisol. But there's clearly people in the other conditions as well that resonate and that release cortisol, right? So it's not like it's conditional that you see the context. And if you want to bring it back to everyday life, I think if people are sensitive and if they know that their partner is constantly stressed, I don't think they need to always see that. I think the knowledge of this is very, very present also for children, right? That, I mean, that mom is not in a good mood because she's very stressed. And so I think it really depends on the situation, whether or not that is enough. And in the lab, I mean, if you think about it, we had strangers watch through the video, right? And they really had nothing to do with the person that was being directly stressed. And still, they showed cortisol release, and some of them resonated. So yeah. And now to the second question. Yes, the mindfulness-based stress reduction is in a way a secularized form of Buddhist meditation, right? All of these practices source in Buddhist meditation, and all of them are secularized. So the ethics in a way are taken out to make it easier for people in our society to accept what they're learning. There's interesting studies now that show that taking yes, there's positive resonance, like there's positive people really like it and commit to the mindfulness-based stress reduction. But if you compare the very secularized programs with those that still have some ethics in there and some traditional teachings, you can see that especially the affect training has a much higher impact. So I don't think it's necessarily good to strip these programs free of all their ethical basics. And then if you look at, for example, empathy and compassion, it looks like some people, if you take the ethics out of the programs, some people even show less compassion after the training than before, if there's no religious context. So I think for a big acceptance of these programs, this was probably necessary to be secularized. But I think now is a time where one could think about introducing some of the ethics back into the programs, maybe not in all, right? This can be individually tailored, but I'm sure that for many people, this would be a valuable add-on. For the usage in companies and why is it done? Is it really done to improve the well-being of the trainee, or is it done to have more efficient workers? I think it's hard to say. I mean, in a way, you could conclude that if it's a win-win situation for everybody, why not, right? If clearly people do work more efficiently, we showed that as well. I didn't show you that data, but attention goes up like immensely, not just in the presence module, but in all modules. In general, executive functions are improved, perspective taking is improved. So a lot of cognitive factors that can be very useful for how well you work are targeted by these practices. I don't see it as a problem though, although I can totally see the perspective of saying, well, but who's it good for then, right? Yeah.
I'd have another question if you don't mind.
No.
I was interested in thinking about the kind of group context. I guess I'm going to ask the collective behavior question for the collective behavior seminar. I was just curious, you know, a lot of the stuff that you've been talking about has been about how pairs of people interact. And I was wondering if you are thinking about any studies maybe in the future on you know, if you're interacting with multiple people, say you have like multiple friends and one of them is really stressed, but like, can you buffer the stress of one with another? Or like, if you have two stressed friends, is that then really bad? Yeah, I was just wondering what your thoughts are on how this might work in a more beyond a pair context, I guess.
You mean the effects on a more general level, or really how would you statistically go about it?
Oh, I mean, I meant more the effects, like, or whether you know of any,
yeah,
you know, whether you guys are working in that direction at all.
We're testing stuff, but this is, I mean, this is extremely hard, and so what we are doing is we're using these biofeedback devices and having group discussions. For now, we're really keeping it easy. It's 4 people. We record their behavior, we record their discussion. So it's both on a behavioral level, and then we look at their physiological activity, sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system activity. And the idea is really to understand who influences whom, right? So this is what I already talked about with Jens's questions earlier. It's to see whether there's for now, that's what we're doing, to see whether there's single individuals in a group that have the capacity to influence everybody, that are like an epicenter, whether that's not the right word, but that are really those in the groups that radiate whatever it is, whether good or bad. And the hypothesis here is that there's really 2 patterns, that you have the people that are low in sympathetic activity and high in parasympathetic activity, and vice versa, that probably have the strongest influence on everybody in between. So for now, we're starting it with a fairly easy paradigm. And the idea is really to then understand whether that is correct, or whether everybody influences everybody all over the place, right? So I hope that's not the case. And that would make it extremely interesting then to later place people of which we know they have this activity and who potentially even trained it into larger groups, and see whether this can spread within the group. They're either good or bad physiological pattern.
So what do you think, like how technology can be used to study stress reduction, and also to provide new ways of therapies? I'm thinking of virtual reality, also in combination maybe with this biofeedback approaches and so on. Because of course there are many advantages of using virtual reality and virtual humans maybe to study this. So can you feel also empathy and stress from a virtual character, for example? Did you ever, or do you have some feedback on this or some intuition?
I don't, and you know what? I'm somehow reluctant to go down that road. because I know that there's also a virtual reality TSST, like stress test at least, and I know that it's been proven efficient to trigger cortisol release, but I feel, yeah, I don't know, I've just not thought down that road. I mean, of course, we're thinking towards telecommunication, right, and therapy via the computer, and also trying to figure out or think about how can you actually transport compassion and empathy through this channel, right? I think that would be extremely important. Is it maybe a protection for the therapist, but at the same measure makes therapy less strong and less helpful and real for the person on the other side of the computer, for the patient? I mean, we're definitely also right now during the pandemic situation have been talking a lot about that in the lab, but we haven't really made up our minds about whether or not we want to go down this road.